Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Well, we've got a great topic for you today. Here it is. Implementing a custom user interface on the Horner OCS. We're actually going to be covering this topic over the next 2 weeks. We're breaking it down as a 2-week series. Now, if there's one area that automation engineers are probably a little bit undertrained, and that is user interface design. Now, most of us have an engineering background, and generally at most universities, user interface design is something you'll find on the curriculum either in the computer science department or maybe the graphic design department. So many of us automation engineers with an engineering background, we really don't know that much about the theories of user interface design. But who are the ones who are designing most of the user interfaces for machine controllers out there? Well, it's those same automation engineers. Now, I think it'd be great to have a series on the theory of good user interface design and, about effective and safe machine control user interface design, but that's not what we're going to do for the next couple weeks. We'll save those topics for the future. What we're going to cover over the next 2 weeks is a scenario that I've run into a few times in my career, and that is this. I'm assisting a customer with a new machine design, a new machine, or I'm working with a system integrator, and the end client has put a lot of thought and a lot of investment in the actual user interface design for their machine. They've actually hired a graphic designer or an industrial designer to do a complete design for them. Now, I'm not talking hardware. I'm talking screens and graphics and images and fonts and how is the data going to be presented and what's the screen navigation look like in terms of exactly what buttons get you to which screens. It's a complete design, all paid for and, hired out to a graphics designer. And the graphics designer has handed that design over to the client and they're handing it over to you as a system integrator. Now, I've had a couple reactions to that in the past. My first reaction is hallelujah, because one of the real challenges in working with clients is really getting the user interface details right, because they very often kind of know what they want in their head, but they don't specify it very well. The second thing I often think is, wow, well, how are we going to actually implement this? We have a set of tools available for us on the user interface equipment, a set of software and a set of features. How are we going to incorporate this advanced user interface design into that equipment with that software? Well, the good news is, in all the occasions this has happened in my career, it's had a really good result. Because everything was so well thought out and well developed, we were able to incorporate that exact user interface pretty much. And in the end, the client just accepted it. It worked as they had specified, and there wasn't any haggling and sunk engineering hours on tweaking the user interface, which often happens when it's not designed ahead of time. Okay, so that's the plan for the next couple weeks. This week, we're talking graphics. Next week, we're talking fonts. All right, here's how we're specifically breaking down today's topic for this week. Okay, we're going to start by just clarifying what we mean by a user interface and specifically what we mean by a custom user interface. We're going to talk about some of the different output formats in which your client might hand you over a custom user interface design. We're going to talk about how you can then take that output and implement it in Cscape. And then for those of you who maybe haven't run into this situation, but you learned some things through today's process that you might want to incorporate in your own design, we'll show you some online resources that are available to you that you might be able to use to do some of these same things on a system which doesn't utilize a graphic design firm, for instance. And of course, we'll have plenty of demonstrations throughout. All right, let's dive right in. Okay, so when we talk about user interface, what do we mean by user interface for the purposes of today's discussion? Well, when a lot of us automation engineers think about a user interface, we think about a physical device. Usually these days, it's a color touchscreen of various sizes. We think about the screens we need to develop, what kind of buttons and navigation we need to develop, those sorts of things. But really, in the more general sense, a user interface is just the creation of visuals that appear on digital products. So a industrial OCS all-in-one controller or a HMI or an operator interface that's used in an industrial application, those are really just digital products with visuals, obviously, that are used to interface with the user, with the operator in a lot of cases. Now, that has a lot of different components. What colors are used? That's something us as automation engineers, we don't think about that much. We're not graphics designers. We use whatever colors are available. And sometimes our selections frankly, don't end up with the best results because of our lack of training in that area. The visual elements of things, what's the text look like? How big should it be? What images should we use? Should we use icons? What kind of buttons should we use? Should we use sliders? Should we use a increment decrement button? Should we use a selector switch? Those sorts of things. How are we going to present any data or information? What does the text look like maybe for any instructions? If there's a status of the machine we need to get across to the operator, what's the best way of doing that? Graphically or with some sort of, lighted push button simulation? All those sorts of things. And then of course, navigation. What screens do we need to develop and how are users going to get from screen to screen efficiently and in a very obvious fashion? Those are all elements of user interface, of course. Now, when we're talking about a custom user interface, for the sake of today's discussion, again, we're talking about a user interface that's been purpose designed, typically by an industrial designer or a graphics designer, and that's handed over to you, Mr. Application Automation Engineer, and your job is to implement it as closely as possible as designed. So that's our task for today. What kind of tips and tricks in Cscape can we use to take this pre-designed user interface and incorporate it for our client's machine? Okay, so first of all, what are they actually physically handing you? Is it a piece of paper? Is it a set of files? What are we actually talking about here? Well, it could take a variety of different forms. It might be what's called a storyboard. That's like a comic strip. It could be an electronic format or written format where effectively it's showing you sketches, not artist-ready renderings, images, but just sketches that show you kind of the layout of how things should go, all right? What the user should do, what screens the user should navigate to set up the machine, that sort of thing. Or it could be what's called a wireframe, very similar to a storyboard, but generally with a little bit more detail included, but still not with, ready-to-go graphics. Then there's the mock-up, and that's where we get to the stage where if they hand you a mock-up, those are files that really include realistic looking images. If you just looked at the images, you would say, terrific, the user interface is done. It looks done. It looks complete. But in reality, those are emulations, if you will, of what the user interface looks like. Everything is scaled properly, is just as the client wants, and it's an image format. But of course, it doesn't have variable data or active buttons or any of those sorts of things that actually brings the user interface to life. And then another thing you might be handed is something called a design theme. That might be, hey, here's the palette of colors we'll be using in this user interface. Here's the fonts we want to use or the font we want to use if it's just one. Here are the set of icons we're going to use for this particular user interface, and we want you to use these. So those are all things that could be deliverables in your hands that you could use to put into life this specific design. Now, today we're going to focus on the mock-up and the design theme. So if there's a storyboard or a wireframe, that's great information, but all the graphics still need to be developed. When we have a mock-up and we also have a design theme, then those things are definitive and we just need to incorporate those things into our design without really having to draw them, really just taking those files or that information and incorporating it in the software. Okay, so let's start with something simple. Let's start with just the color palette. Let's say the customer says, hey, here's the colors we're using. We've given you the mock-ups. Here's what everything looks like. And here are the specific colors that are being used in this particular design. Now, that's great. You don't have to figure out what colors you need to use. But I think a lot of us don't think about the fact that, with the Horner OCS, along with a lot of other user interfaces, I'm sure, you do have the ability to specify the color down to the very last detail. So if it's specified to you in like RGB or CMYK color format, which hopefully it is, then you can very easily incorporate those colors into your project, and we'll show you how to do that. Let's actually get started with just that very simple task of incorporating custom colors into your project. So let's head over to Cscape. Okay. And as you'd expect, let's head to the graphics design area or the graphic editor. All right, and I just have an X4 controller here. So To add a custom color, there's no special area in the software where you add the color. You just add the color as the course of, creating or doing some graphics editing. So let's say that we're just going to right click here and say set background, as if we're going to set the background to a set color. We just select background color, and then we have a set of standard colors available to us. But if we want a custom color, or to pick from a more detailed color, we hit the more button here, and then we have all these colors, and we have the ability to set up custom colors. So I've already got 3 custom colors set here. So if I want to add another one, maybe based on my client specification, I click in this area here, and then I type in the red, green, and the blue parameters. Okay, so for the color I want to add here, the red element is 232, the green is 27, and the blue is 84. And this gives me a very specific red that the client wants to use. So as I double click on this, okay, or hit double clicking does nothing, but hitting add to custom colors, you can see now that color is available for me to select if I want to use it anytime on the project, whether it's for a font or a screen background or part of an object, whatever, it's going to be there available for me to pick the next time I come into this dialog, which is for every graphical object that is programmable in Cscape. So that's really all there is to it. So if I decide on this trip, I'll just pick one of these previously created colors and say okay and okay. Now I've got the specific blue that my client wanted to use for this particular project. So that's as easy as it can get, really, for adding custom colors into your project. All right, let's move on and take a look at some of the other things that we may need to do in the course of incorporating a custom user interface. All right, let's talk about the screens now. And specifically, when we're given a mock-up or a prototype, which is a set of files for each screen that shows exactly what the screen is going to look like, well, these are developed graphics that the client's already approved, so why not mine these resources to create the screens for our custom user interface? Now, we usually can't take these graphics directly and use them without any changes. It's going to require some sort of image editing, so you're going to have to use an image editor as part of this task. Now, I happen to use the Adobe package when I do my image editing, and that, of course, is about the most expensive one you can get. But there's plenty of image editors out there. You just need something that's going to give you the ability to go in and do scaling, to be able to delete certain sections of the image, those sorts of things. So there's plenty of image editors that will work. And then, of course, at the end, you're going to want to put the file in the right file format and the right size so it's easily imported into the Horner OCS. And again, best practice for sure is to perform as much of that image manipulation as you can outside of Cscape, because those software packages, of course, just do a terrific job. So what is the workflow we would use to accomplish this? Well, I'm starting with a mock-up that I actually got from the internet legally. It's a mock-up that I paid for a thermostat design. And I wanted to incorporate this particular thermostat design into the Horner OCS. So what's my approach here? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this picture after it's been edited as the background for a screen on the Horner OCS. But that background is going to be used after I've removed all the objects which are going to be changing. So in the case of this thermostat, we have a temperature value, which is real-time data. That obviously is going to be changing based on the temperature of the room or wherever this thermostat's installed. There are icons on the screen. Now, if these icons were status icons that would be appearing or not appearing based on the status of the machine, or in this case, the thermostat, then those also would need to be variable and would need to be removed from the screen and replaced again as icons later. But in this case, I'm assuming that those icons are all being used for navigation to navigate to different screens. And in that scenario, we can just leave them there and then put invisible push buttons on top of them, jump buttons for navigation, and regular old push buttons for the increment and decrement keys at the right side there that's present in that particular design. So again, once we've removed all the graphics that aren't stationary, then we want to make sure that we have adjusted the graphic so that it's the proper dimension, both in terms of aspect ratio and size, in terms of pixels, so that it just imports right in to the Horner OCS. And then we need to pick a file format that's friendly to the Horner OCS. And frankly, I know it sounds old-fashioned, but BMP files or bitmap files are a really good choice because there's no interpretation of the colors or the pixels. It's pixel perfect. And again, the OCS just takes the bitmap file and draws it directly. With other formats like JPEG, for instance, there's compression and decompression and those sorts of things going on. They still can work really well, but I would say bitmap is preferred, and 16-bit color depth is what's the best choice for most OCS models. Okay, so, and then of course the last step for this scenario when we're importing this particular graphic as the background for a screen, the static background for a screen, we're going to import it as a static bitmap. That's what we'll be doing. All right, so let's go ahead back to Cscape and show you how we do this. All right, so we're here on this screen, and let's say this is the screen where we want to use that image as a background. Now at this stage, I've already done the editing. I've already eliminated all the elements that are changing so that I can't be used as a static wallpaper, if you will. And I've already resized it as necessary, and I've got everything ready to go. So I use the static bitmap object here, and I just drop it on the screen. Now I don't necessarily have to fill it. I don't necessarily have to fill the entire screen as I drop it here, but for a full-size screen, I typically do it myself. So I've sized it for the entire screen, double-clicked on it. All right, now before I select the specific bitmap, I'm going to bump up my colors all the way to the max. All right, I'm going to get rid of this scale to fit option because I've already scaled my graphic to the exact size using my imaging software. Now, because it's taking up the entire screen, I don't need to worry about any kind of transparency or anything. So at this stage, I can just pick my bitmap. So let's do that here. Here is the image. We'll hit open. And even though it looks a little out of proportion here, that's just because the preview window is square and we're looking at a rectangular image here. So we're pretty much done. Again, no transparency to worry about. So we just hit OK, and there we go. So there is our image. All right, just as it should look on the screen. At least that is the start of our image. Of course, we're going to need to add a large font over the top for the temperature. We're going to have to add a bar graph or the appropriate graphics here to go up and down as we increment and decrement. But how are we going to handle like jump buttons if we're going to be jumping using these graphics? And how are we going to handle incrementing and decrementing? Let's show you that. What we're basically going to do is we're going to overlay invisible buttons over the top. So let's start with these navigational buttons here. So I'm going to select a jump button up here from the top. Here's a jump button. I'm going to place it over the area where the user is going to press, let's say that gear head, and let's say that's going to take us to screen number 2. So I'm going to fill this out just like any other jump object, but I'm going to go to attributes and I'm going to uncheck visible. That will make this object invisible. All right, now what I like to do, because the object will be visible to me in the software, is I like to go in and set a legend that basically says where this is going to. So this, let's say, is going to the setup screen. All right, and then I also, just to leave more room for text, I like to go under attributes and get rid of the icon on the actual drawing of the button itself. Okay, so here's my setup button I have here. It's invisible, that's what the X means. And so at runtime, when I press this, I'm going to jump to screen 2. All right, but the user is going to think that the jump button has been painted this really attractive icon. So that's how that works. Now, how am I going to do increment and decrement? Well, in this case, I'm going to also place some buttons on here, but this time they're going to be just standard push buttons that will be tied to some logic some simple logic in the program that will add 1 or subtract 1, if that's the appropriate math that needs to be done, from a variable that's being incremented or decremented. So basically that's all we have to do. So again, I go in here, find the variable that is going to be turned on by the button. In this case, it's increment. Okay. And just like before, I go to attributes and I get rid of visible. All right. And like I like to do for documentation purposes, I go under the legend because it's going to be obscure what's behind it, and I hit increment. All right, and I hit OK. All right, so there we go. We've placed an invisible push button. When this area of the screen is pressed, even though they won't see this button, they'll be incrementing, and then in my program, that variable will be turning on, and I will be adding 1 to the total. And then to do decrement, it's going to be basically identical. I hit copy there. I'll hit paste. I'll move it down. I'll double click. I'll change to a different variable, in this case, decrement, and I'll change my legend to indicate that as well. And again, the legend is just for my purposes so that I know what I'm looking at because it's obfuscating what's below there. Okay, so that's, pretty simple stuff. I've got a background graphic that I'm using. I've overlaid invisible operators on top of that. I'll do the same over here for these 3 navigations. And then, of course, later on in the project, I'll be adding a custom data field here to make everything look just the way that it looks for, that the user designer intended, or the graphics designer intended, and we'll be good to go. Let's take a quick look at what this looks like on the bench, just as I've drawn it here. Okay, so there we go. And as you can see, it looks pretty much as the graphic designer intended it. Obviously, we've got a lot of work to do to finish things up, but that's really all there is to it. So a little bit of image work external to Cscape, bring it in carefully so it comes in just the way you want it, and you can end up with some really outstanding results. All right, so let's head back to our presentation, and let's move on to the next phase of incorporating a custom graphic design, and that is custom icons and custom operators. Now, I used some of the pre-drawn icons that were kind of, on that original image graphic just as part of the wallpaper or part of the background. So those weren't actually separate files, but there's plenty of occasions when I'm going to need actually a separate icon indicator that I can move around various screens. And I could be handed a list of files or disk or USB drive, if you will, with a series of icons on it that the designer wants incorporated into the project. So that's what we're going to show you here. Now, it's very similar to what we just did in terms of the fact that you're going to do most of your work in an image editing program, and effectively by incorporating icons and in some cases custom operators. And custom operators might be a custom slide switch like I'm showing on the screen, or a custom push button, some sort of operator the operator will actually use that the graphic designer wants to look a specific way to fit a functional appearance or theme. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here, icons and custom operators. So the workflow, again, very similar to before. You do your image editing externally. The only difference here really is that now, because this object that we're going to be using is not full screen, if you want a transparent background on that object, like a round icon I've shown there on the screen, then you need to make sure that the transparency is going to work properly. Now, with Cscape 9.9, we don't support PNG files, where a file format that has transparency built in. Cscape 10 and Canvas will support those. But I will say Cscape 9.9 actually does a really good job of removing the background from most objects. Where it struggles is if the background color is also used in the graphic itself. Then it doesn't really know what it should remove and what it shouldn't remove. So in that scenario, let's say you're bringing in some icons, and for whatever reason, because the color of the background is used in the middle of the graphic, that Cscape can't effectively remove the background. Well, in that scenario, just use your image editing software and put some sort of wild color that doesn't match anything in the graphic as your new background using the paint tool, and then Cscape will have a really easy time to bring that in. Now, if you're bringing in an icon for the purposes of a jump button or something, some sort of modular jump button, then you're going to bring it in again as a static bitmap. However, if you're bringing in an image or a set of images as an animation object, in other words, to show something that's off or on, running or not running, that sort of thing, then you're going to want to bring it in not as a static bitmap, but as an animation object. All right, so that's really the approach you need to take there. All right, so now let's take a look at how we deal with custom icons and operators for this part of the project. Okay, so we're heading back to Cscape again. All right, this time let's go ahead and move to a different screen, and let's go ahead and bring in an icon as an independent graphic, if you will. Okay, so I'm just going to bring it in because it's just one graphic. It's not a set of graphics. I'm going to bring in one graphic. I'm going to use the animated bitmap object. Now, I don't have to size the box to any particular size. All right, I just drew it so it's reasonable size. Double click here. Again, I max out my colors. Always do that. And I get rid of the scale to fit button if, as I recommend, you have previously scaled the graphic to be the size that you want. All right, now I go ahead and pick my bitmap. Let's pick one which just has a regular background. We've not done anything special for the background. All right, here it is. We brought it in. Let's say okay. All right, so that looks fine, but if we don't have a white background color, then we're going to want to get rid of those white areas around the perimeter there. However, if we say treat the background as transparent, Cscape is going to struggle to not remove some of the areas in the center, which are also the same color as the background. So that result is not going to be what we want. So instead, we're much better off with importing a graphic where we have filled the background with a much different color. So now when we say treat background as transparent and we select a transparency color that's similar, okay, and we hit this treat similar color as transparent button. Now, as we slide this slider, we just keep sliding it until the red goes away. It's pretty much gone there. We say okay, and bingo, we get a really nice result. So again, bringing in a small graphic, whether it's an icon or just an image, those are some tricks you'll want to play in order to get everything looking terrific. All right, now let's say we're going to bring in a custom operator, a custom slide switch that the graphic designer wants to incorporate in the project. Now, of course, Cscape has slide switches, but they're not the exact ones that the graphic designer designed. So let's do some custom slide switches. All right, so this time, because the switch could either be on or off, I'm not going to use a static bitmap. I'm going to use an animation instead. So again, I'm just sizing it, no particular size. Double click after I've selected it here. And this dialog looks a little bit different. First of all, we have to tie this particular object to a variable. And we're going to tie it to our enable variable so that when the enable variable is on, we're going to display one graphic. When the enable variable is off, we're going to display a different graphic. Again, we want to max out our colors. All right. And then when the value of enable is a 0, we want to pick our frame. And that's going to be this guy right here. That's the slide switch in the off position. And then when the frame number or the value of enable is 1, we're going to pick this frame, which is the slide switch in the on position. All right. Now, let's go ahead and hit OK and see what things look like. Again, two things. One is it looks all stretched out of proportion and we haven't gotten rid of the background. How can we fix that? All right. Well, to fix the stretched out of proportion part of it, we uncheck scale to fit. And then if we want to treat the background as transparent, for each image, we need to click this button. And we can see really from the preview that Cscape didn't have any trouble at all with that. So again, treat background as transparent. We're good to go there as well. So now when we look at it, yep, this has been sized perfectly. It looks at home on this particular screen and everything looks good. Now, right now, I have not checked the touch button here, so which means that this is a read-only object, which is going to show us the status of the variable, but won't allow us to change it. If we want this to be an active button that the operator or an active slide switch the operator can operate, then we need to select the touch operator here. And again, if this is an object that is strictly an indicator, I'll show both instances here. The one on top is operational. The one on the bottom is just status only. So that's how you differentiate between this sort of operator that's read-only and the operator that the operator can actually do something with. Okay, so that's incorporating both like an icon or a small image as well as a custom operator. Let's take a look at that and what that looks like on the bench. All right, we've got our, in this case, I had previously downloaded this project and I had two icons that I had drawn. But let me show you that operator in action. So you can see by touching the top one, I was able to change the state of that from off to on and vice versa. But the bottom one is read-only, so that one is just showing the current status. That's all that's going on with that guy. All right, so that is importing icons and custom operators into your project for the custom user interface. All right, so those were the main things I wanted to show you today, the tips and tricks to be able to take that customized, designed user interface and incorporate it in the OCS. Now, that's just the first part of the project. Next week, we're going to go through fonts, and I'm going to show you kind of the finished result of my thermostat project so you can see how I was able to effectively completely incorporate that user interface. All right, but before we say goodbye for today, I did want to mention that if you're not in this scenario where you're taking a previously designed user interface and that's being handed to you by your client, but instead you'd like to incorporate some of these design features into your next project that you design, there are a number of websites and a number of companies that offer content that could be useful to you in your projects. And that can include things like icon sets that were drawn by, professional artists. It can be color sets, different palettes of colors that work well together. It could be a series of objects that you want to mimic on an OCS, again, designed by an artist or a graphic designer. So now you can look for free content, that you can do, but I will tell you that these sites that we've used in the past or that I've used in the past really are not that expensive. And you get some really well-drawn, very effective material that you can use in your project. And yes, they do have a cost to them, but you can find royalty-free objects which won't have a recurring cost. It's a one-time cost purchasing up front. But as always, carefully examine the use license to make sure you're not violating anybody's copyrights for the material that they have created. So definitely don't do that. So the types of things you can find, though, you can find all kinds of images and illustrations. Of course, Cscape has a symbol library that's available that you can use internal to Cscape if you choose that option. However, it doesn't have everything. And so you may well find particular images that you want to use in your project. You might find specific icons like those warning icons there. Again, different color palettes, specific mock-ups, you might be able to find that for your particular device. Just all kinds of things available to take a look at to take your user interface quality up to the next level. Okay, this is where I remind you that we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, whether we're fully live, like today, or whether we're pre-recorded. But we've always got someone standing by to answer your questions. If you're watching live, give us those questions in the chat section. If you're watching on replay, just give us those comments and questions in the comment section, and we'll get back to you pretty darn quickly. OCS training schedule is marching right along. Our next course is the advanced course, which is next week. We'll be adding to the training schedule as the year goes on, but don't count on, missing any of these upcoming courses if you want to get training in for sure this year. Check our website and get signed up today. We do still have some slots available for next week, I might add. So if your schedule would allow a last-minute trip to Indianapolis for factory advanced training, I would recommend it. We have lots of resources available on our website, on our YouTube channel, on LinkedIn. There's lots of ways for you to interact with us, and we'd love to see you, I guess, in that particular online way sometime soon. So use one of those available resources and make a connection. Okay, next week, part 2, we're going to focus on the fonts, how to import a specific font that a graphic designer has in mind, and how to make sure that it's going to fit in the memory that's allocated to fonts in the OCS, even if it's like a micro OCS, which doesn't have a ton of memory. And then we'll also be finishing up our thermostat mock-up as an actual working user interface, and I'll show you all the tips and tricks that I used to kind of finish up that particular project. Okay, so if you haven't subscribed to our channel, don't hesitate to do so. It doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. Okay, so until next week when we talk user interface part 2, let's all get out there and do us some good.